Today we are going to look at the origin of the First World War. On 28th of June 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir apparent of Austria, was assassinated by a Serbian extremist named Gabriel Princip, and this set off a very serious diplomatic crisis. Austria served an ultimatum on Serbia, which, if accepted, would have abrogated the independence and sovereignty of Serbia. Germany virtually gave a carte blanche to Austria, and the German Kaiser went on a cruise. The July crisis, as it was termed, seemed would not lead to a war immediately. But with Russia solidly backing Serbia and general mobilizations following, war appeared to be a distinct possibility. In the event, Austria declared war on Serbia at the end of July, on 28th of July. Russia ordered general mobilization on the 30th of July, and Germany followed on the 31st. Germany declared war on Russia on 1st of August and on France on 3rd of August. A mood of anxious excitement prevailed in Paris. On 31st July, Jean Jaurès, who was a socialist leader in France and had been won over to the cause of war, which the socialists consistently opposed in view of the need to fight an autocratic Germany, was assassinated by a right-wing activist. And this was seen as the source of a major crisis in France. When Germany declared war on Russia, France was obliged by her alliance with Russia to join the war. The Austrian socialist leader Victor Adler said, I'm quoting him, "War unchains instincts, all forms of madness," unquote. Britain entered the war on 4th of August as the Belgian neutrality was violated by the German execution of what was known as the Schlieffen Plan, that is, moving in a sickle-like movement through Belgium into France. And on 4th of August, Britain declared war on Germany. On 3rd of August, Grey, Sir Edward Grey, who had earlier tried to negotiate a settlement, looked out of the windows of his Foreign Office and commented, I'm quoting him, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit in our lifetime," unquote. Well, many expected this to be a very short war, and indeed expressed confidence that the soldiers would be back home by Christmas. The German Crown Prince even said that they expected a jolly short war, but the war was not to be a short one, certainly not a jolly one. The outbreak of the First World War, it was widely assumed at one point of time, was the end of one epoch, and the end of the war was the beginning of another epoch. But there is no doubt that the impact or the consequences of the war, the Russian Revolution, for example, the upheaval in several European countries, including Germany, Hungary, Italy, the disintegration of the two multi-ethnic empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Europe and the Ottoman Empire spanning Asia and Europe, have determined the course of the history of much of the 20th century. To begin with, there was the need to apportion the blame to someone who was seen to have caused the war. The result of the war facilitated this in a way because Germany was defeated. But even before the war, Lenin had dubbed this, and the Bolsheviks had dubbed this war as an imperialist war. And Lenin, in his celebrated pamphlet, wrote that imperialism was the highest stage of capitalism. So there was a perception even before the war that what caused the war, this was certainly the Marxist interpretation, was a fight amongst the capitalist countries for the sharing or division of the resources available elsewhere beyond Europe. And capitalist great powers, we know in the late 19th century partitioned Africa, conquered many remaining parts of Asia, and so there was a substance to these views. Indeed, after the revolution, the Bolsheviks did not continue to participate in what they dubbed as an imperialist war, and Lenin proclaimed his famous decree on peace, where they talked of a peace without annexations and indemnities. After the conclusion of the war, during the Versailles Treaty, it was felt necessary to apportion the blame on Germany and her allies, because Germany and the Central Powers, her close allies like Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria and Turkey, were defeated powers. So it was possible to argue that it was Prussian militarism and German expansionism, aided and abetted by her allies, that had caused the war. This was in a way canonized through what came to be known as the guilt clause in the Treaty of Versailles, Article 231, which said that Germany must accept the responsibility of causing the war and, as a consequence, must also compensate the losses suffered by the allied countries and their population. It was very popular kind of a slogan in the British elections after the war, like hang the Kaiser. If Germany were responsible for this, then the Kaiser must also be punished with some exemplarity. Now, while this was the view of the victorious powers, that Germany and Germany's eccentricities, certain lack of, anointing with a liberal oil when the German unification was achieved, had made Germany a potential threat to international stability. Therefore, the war was caused because of German militarism, expansionism, and peculiarities of German developments. In contrast to this, or rather opposite to this, was the view of a good section of Germans, shared particularly by the Army High Command and the war veterans, and disseminated later among a larger part of the German population. They developed the theory of Stas Legenda, or a stab in the back. They refused to believe that Germany had indeed been defeated in the war. They argued that Germany should not have signed the armistice and continued. The armistice was a stab in the back effected by the Social Democrats. Needless to add, they were unhappy that the Kaiser had to abdicate and that the German Empire collapsed, leading to the beginning of what came to be known as the Weimar Republic. While the Treaty of Versailles then put the stamp of guilt on Germany and her allies, the historians began to introspect, and instead of looking for a very facile and generalized explanation in the guilt of Germany, tried to look at more deeply embedded causes of the origins of the war. They also tried to look at the long-distance factors that had worked in creating the dynamics of international relations leading to the war. G. Lois Dickinson's influential book, The International Anarchy, 1904 to 1914, was an influential book in the sense that it opened new angles of inquiry. The system of alliances divided Europe into two armed blocs, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. And this prevented any war from remaining localized because the alliances involved a chain reaction in which the involvement of one power tended to drag the other powers into the war to make it a more general war. Furthermore, they also blamed the old diplomacy for adding to these fault lines. This diplomacy was secret. They were secretly negotiated and the terms were not made public. So in a way, the diplomats, by having recourse to what came to be known as secret diplomacy, committed their nations to an eventual and possible war without the knowledge of the people. Now, this view was lent credence later when President Wilson at the end of the war talked of open covenants of peace openly arrived at. Therefore, Wilson argued strongly in favor of what he called that diplomacy must always be conducted frankly and in full public view. The structure of international politics and fault lines inherent within this structure was suggested as another major factor. A third factor that the historians harped on was nationalism. Now, nationalism was, particularly in the post-French revolutionary area, was becoming, as we had seen much earlier, a potent force. Nationalism, as it developed in course of the 19th century in Europe, acted both as a unifying and as a divisive force. The unification came in the shape of the kind of acquitment of nationalism in Germany and Italy. The countries were unified. Belgium and Greece had earned their independence much earlier. Later, there were different ethnic groups which lived under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was a multi-ethnic empire, and the Ottoman Empire, were also growing increasingly restive and looked for their own autonomous existence, for the right of self-determination, if not for downright independence. The situation in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and in the Ottoman Empire provided always a very potential cause of conflict. And indeed, in the late 19th century, particularly the situation in the Ottoman Empire had repeatedly led to breach of peace. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire was so very sensitive to the demands of national self-determination that they became almost paranoia about such demands and such movements. There was another aspect to nationalism as well. It was what increasingly came to be known as chauvinism, jingoism, etc. These were terms which were coined during this period. It related to even the nation states or national states using nationalism as a ploy to mobilize people. And it was, in a way, a competition among the nation states to carve out a larger space for itself. And this extreme heat that nationalism tended to create, mobilization, creation of a very radical and demanding public opinion, the role of the media, of the government, mobilization, increase of armaments, all these tended to create a situation which made maintenance of peace increasingly fragile. There were other factors as well. For example, the armaments race. Now, this could be related to the fault lines within the international structure. As countries felt increasingly insecure, they had recourse to building of arms, which they felt was their only guarantee to security. And this was reflected in the increasing military budgets of all the countries. See, the historians found it as a boon when the archives, old archives, were gradually opened up after the war. The whole process was started by Trotsky in Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution. The old Tsarist archives were open and they were against the older secret treaties. The older secret treaties of the Tsarist government had now become public property. The British and the French governments were embarrassed and they also started opening their archives. Even in Germany, Karl Kautsky was asked to compile the documents from the archives from Foreign Office, and the result was that about 39 volumes were published in 1927, and the title of the publication was called The High Policy of European Cabinets. So in the 1920s and the 1930s, historians got to know more and more about what happened before 1914 in international relations, in the negotiations among the powers, and got to know about the secret treaties as well. This changed their perspective gradually. Historians now had different questions as well, and they had a whole new material before them to use to ask these questions or find the answers to these questions. German historian Ranke had earlier argued for Primat den Außenpolitik, or the primacy of foreign policy in the destiny of a nation. And arguing this, foreign policy was seen as an autonomous part of a nation's existence, and that foreign policy, as it were, was conducted on terms of foreign policy itself. And therefore, again, in this view, Germany was found to be wanting. Blames were primarily put on Germany, but gradually on Austria-Hungary, on Britain, on France, on Russia as well. What happened as far as historiography is concerned is that an entire new angle that gradually came up after the Second World War. The Second World War, which came only 20 years after the end of the First World War, tended now to link the two wars. Particularly the question of German guilt was rekindled, and it was even easier now to apportion the blame to Germany because of the phenomenon of Hitler, his aggression, the Holocaust, and the decimation of millions of Jews. Therefore, there was one view that again, there must be something wrong with Germany which causes First and then the Second World War. And again, it would be very facile to argue that it is Germany which has caused the war, and there is no need for further debate. On the other hand, there grew a group of historians who tried to also look at the internal dynamics of foreign policy of a country. As opposed to Ranke, they would now argue for primat den Innenpolitik, primacy of internal history. And a very forceful author was Fritz Fischer in Germany. He wrote his first book, Germany's War Aims in the First World War. Now, he also argued for Germany's responsibility, but from a different angle altogether. He showed that the Germany did have annexationist aims in the First World War, but he suggested that Germany deliberately went into war in 1914 in order to win their short-term goals or objectives, and they had expected this to be a short war. And he was relating this to Germany's internal requirements. And other historians like David Kallio had also talked of the political economic roots of, for example, Bismarck's foreign policy. They said in a competitive world and shrinking opportunities, Germany increasingly in the last decade of the 19th and the first decade of the 20th century had a feeling of encirclement. Germany was being encircled with shrinking business opportunities. Now, in this situation, some argued that the best policy of Germany would be to come out of this encirclement, and it could be achieved only through a short war. The Weltpolitik or world politics that Kaiser William II had initiated was a part of this urge. The Germany needs to go out and play the role of a world power if Germany's greatness as a power, if Germany's achievements as an economic power were to be preserved. Fischer continued his argument with a second book called The War of Illusions. He argued that this is the illusion from which German High Command suffered, and Germany was able to co-opt everyone into this, and here probably that extreme nationalism or chauvinistic tendencies probably played a part or a role. Later, James Jones, in his Origins of the First World War, tried to understand these reasons together and kind of synthesize this. Now, it would seem that all these factors had a role, as has been suggested over the last century, had contributed something to the commencement of the war. The gentlemen who took the decisions during the final crisis were often, more than they realized, limited in their choice. They were hamstrung by decisions that their governments had taken earlier. There were earlier crises like the two Moroccan crises of 1904 and 1911. There was a question of Anglo-German naval rivalry, which had never really been resolved. There was a crisis of 1908 when Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina, and it seemed that there could at any time be a very serious problem. In this way, we finally see that there was a kind of conjuncture of different events. Jingoism again was almost common in all the countries of Europe. We have an example in Britain, for example, from the 1980s, when a couplet became famous. We don't want to fight, but by Jingo, if we do, We've got the ships, we've got the men, we've got the money too. This has been called a kind of social Darwinism. Just as in Darwin's theory there was a survival of the fittest in the natural world, there was likewise a contest, a struggle in the world of states where the strongest were likely to survive. This led to an increasing armaments budget and expansion of the military in each and every country. And the alliance system ultimately left no option for a war to remain local. Flashpoints in the Balkans had been managed by keeping war localized. For example, in the 1870s, even in 1912-13, when there were the Balkan wars among the Balkan countries, the great powers intervened but did not participate. But in 1914, it was not possible to keep that localized anymore. This is, therefore, it was probably this conjunction of different factors that ultimately made war possible, perhaps in a way inevitable. But the question is whether the war was inevitable or not is not one which can be answered except in terms of individual responsibility. A study of individual decisions of 1914 and the limits within which they were made shows that the consequences were not what were expected. If some of the belligerents achieved the goals for which they went to war, the French did recover Alsace-Lorraine, the British ended the German naval challenge, but the price turned out to be much higher than what they had bargained for in 1914. And those countries with even more ambitious ones, like the German drive for world power, etc., the Russian drive towards Constantinople, Austria-Hungary's desperate bid to keep their ramshackle empire intact, found that their ambitions had turned to defeat and ruin. So the war, if it was consciously fought, did not always produce the results which the war was expected to produce. But nevertheless, it would appear that there was an awareness that a war was a choice, one of the choices. And all the factors that we had talked about probably combined to produce the catastrophe of 1914, which was far more disastrous in its impact than anyone had been able to imagine before 1914.